The call came just after sunrise, and Grace Pladl answered it without thinking. Her son called often, sometimes with updates about the baby, sometimes just to fill the silence of his own lonely routines. But the moment she heard him breathe, she sensed something was wrong, something far beyond the ordinary instability she'd grown used to. His voice carried none of its usual heaviness, none of its unpredictability. It was flat in a way that frightened her. "Mom," he said. Then, with the numbness of someone reporting the weather rather than destroying a family, "I killed the baby." For several seconds, Grace said nothing. The words hovered in the air, impossible to understand, impossible to accept. She pressed the phone tighter against her ear, thinking maybe she misheard him. Maybe he was having one of his spiraling episodes. Maybe this was another one of his dramatic threats. But Steven didn't correct himself. He didn't soften. He didn't offer explanation or remorse. "I'm on my way to New York." Grace felt her legs weaken beneath her. She braced a hand against the counter, trying to steady herself, trying to keep her voice from breaking. She asked where he was, told him to stop driving, told him to come home or call someone, anyone. But Steven spoke as if none of those choices existed anymore. His tone never shifted. He didn't elaborate. He didn't justify. He acted like the decision had already been sealed. He told her not to go to the house. He said he left the key under the mat. Then he hung up. The silence he left behind felt suffocating. Grace stood in her kitchen shaking, the phone still in her hand, unable to make sense of the reality forming around her. When she finally dialed 911, the words fell out her mouth in fragments. "My son just called me. He said he killed his baby." She tried to explain more, the part about him heading to New York, the mention of his wife, the instructions not to go to the house. But her voice kept breaking. The dispatcher worked carefully to gather the details, repeating questions through the sound of Grace's trembling breaths. Before the call ended, multiple agencies in 2 states were already notified. Patrol units were sent to the small Nightdale home where Steven had been staying. But the distance between Grace's phone call and what officers found was measured only in minutes. And in those minutes, the outcome had already been written. When they reached the house, everything was quiet. A single key waited on the mat, just as Steven said. Inside, the rooms looked undisturbed at first glance. No overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, just an eerie stillness that didn't match a home with an infant living in it. Officers found 7-month-old Bennett in one of the rooms, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate placement rather than accident. There was no note, no message, no explanation. Later findings would indicate death by homicidal violence consistent with suffocation. The child had been gone for hours. But this was not where the story began, nor where it would end. At the same time officers stood inside that quiet house in North Carolina, Steven was already more than halfway up the East Coast, driving toward the lives he was about to destroy next. The tragedy was no longer isolated to a single home. It was expanding outward, moving toward a point it had been building to for decades. To understand what drove Steven to that final morning, one has to go back to the mid-1990s, to a time when a young girl in Texas and a young man in New York met in the anonymous noise of early internet chat rooms. Steven was 20 years old, living with his mother in Levittown, disconnected from the world except for the electronics he tinkered with and the anger he never learned to control. He was quiet and unpredictable, polite one moment and explosive the next, someone whose emotions turned on invisible hinges. Alyssa Garcia was 15 and searching for connection in a home that felt too rigid and too tense. She found that connection online, where people could present themselves however they chose. Steven presented himself as someone attentive, someone who listened. For Alyssa, who felt unheard in her daily life, that was intoxicating. For Steven, who struggled to form meaningful attachments in the real world, it was something he clung to fiercely. Their conversations turned into nightly habits. The age difference didn't slow him. His interest grew quickly, too quickly, and by the time he traveled from New York to Texas to meet her, he behaved as if she already belonged to him. Her parents recognized the threat immediately. They tried to force him out of her life. But teenage vulnerability and an older man's manipulation proved a combination stronger than their warnings. By 16, Alyssa was pregnant. Her life with Steven was marked by volatility. He couldn't hold a job. Money was always a problem. And when stress closed in on him, he turned violent, punching holes in walls, breaking furniture, threatening suicide if she left. He cried just as easily as he raged, using tears as leverage and remorse as a temporary fix. When their daughter was born in 1998, Alyssa named her Denise. For a moment, she hoped fatherhood might anchor him. It did the opposite. She saw bruises she couldn't explain. She heard long stretches of silence from the baby's room, silence that made her chest tighten. She began to fear that if she stayed, her daughter would not survive. At just 8 months old, Denise was placed into adoption. She was renamed Katie by her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, who lived in Dover, New York. They had no idea of the danger the infant had narrowly escaped. They raised her in a stable home surrounded by love, art supplies, gentle encouragement, and the kind of safety Alyssa had hoped to give her but never could. Katie grew into a thoughtful, creative young woman who loved animals, filled sketchbooks with stories, and dreamed of a future in digital art. She was the kind of daughter parents felt lucky to have. But the past is a way of circling back when curiosity pushes open old doors. As Katie approached her 18th birthday, she felt a growing need to understand her origins. She knew she was adopted. Her parents had been open with her from childhood. But knowing wasn't the same as understanding. And one evening, she opened Facebook and typed the names she had never known beyond faint memories and adoption paperwork. She found Steven and Alyssa almost immediately. The reunion she imagined was simple, meeting the people who brought her into the world, filling in the missing pieces, understanding where she came from. She didn't know that Steven had been waiting 18 years for another chance to control the life he once lost. She didn't know that reconnecting with him would reopen a chapter her adoptive parents prayed would remain sealed forever. She didn't know that the man she hoped to know was the same man who had once stood over her crib with a coldness her mother had fled from. In the summer of 2016, Katie agreed to visit them. She believed she was going to meet her biological history. Steven saw something else entirely. And from the moment she walked into his life again, the path toward April 2018 began to form. Quietly, steadily, disastrously. Katie Fusco entered adulthood with the kind of optimism that comes from being raised in a home where love is steady and uncomplicated. She had 2 parents who encouraged her art, supported her dreams, and never tried to hide the story of her adoption. They told her early, in gentle terms, that she came to them because her biological parents were not able to care for her. It was never framed as a rejection. It was framed as a beginning. And for most of her life, Katie accepted that answer. But turning 18 has a way of widening a doorway inside someone. Curiosity sharpens. Questions deepen. The old stories that once felt complete now seem unfinished. Katie didn't want to replace the family who raised her. She simply wanted to understand the family she came from. She wanted to meet the people who shared her features, her blood, her history. She believed those answers were harmless. On an ordinary night in 2016, she sat at her laptop and typed the names listed in her adoption paperwork. Names she had never associated with real faces. Steven Pladl, Alyssa Garcia. She found them within minutes. There were photos of Steven with 2 younger girls, photos of a modest home in Virginia, photos of life that looked stable from a distance. Nothing about the profiles suggested danger. Nothing hinted at the instability Alyssa once fled. Nothing warned Katie about what waited for her. Katie sent a message. Steven responded almost immediately. That first exchange felt like a crack opening in a sealed wall. She wasn't prepared for how emotional it felt to speak to him. She wasn't prepared for the rush of belonging that sometimes comes with biological connection. She wasn't prepared for the intensity with which Steven responded to her. They talked often. At first it was simple. Questions about childhood, about likes and dislikes, about the years they had missed. But the frequency of Steven's messages grew quickly. He sent long paragraphs. He pressed her to visit. He acted as though this reunion was the most important moment of his life. Katie, who had always been thoughtful and empathetic, tried to interpret his enthusiasm as happiness. She didn't realize that for Steven, it was something else entirely. When she agreed to visit in August 2016, she believed she was stepping into a missing chapter of her life. Alyssa, who had spent nearly 18 years protecting her younger daughters from Steven's temper, tried to prepare for Katie's arrival with an open heart. She hoped the visit would be positive. She prayed Steven would behave. He promised he would. Katie arrived in Henrico County, believing she had stepped into a reunion built on shared history. For the first few days, everything looked normal. Photos were taken. Meals were shared. There were awkward smiles and long conversations. But beneath the surface, Steven's behavior was already shifting. He watched Katie closely. He lingered when she spoke. He followed her around the house in ways that made Alyssa uneasy. At first, Alyssa told herself she was imagining it, that old trauma was coloring her perception. But the unease never left. Over the next few weeks, as Katie extended her stay, the cracks in the reunion widened. The household tension grew sharper. Alyssa and Steven were already sleeping in separate rooms by that time. The relationship between them long eroded. Their conversations often ended in arguments. Steven's temper, once directed at Alyssa, began to simmer in silence whenever Katie wasn't in the room. Alyssa sensed a shift she couldn't articulate, something too wrong to name and too frightening to ignore. The night she found Steven sleeping on the floor in Katie's room, she felt the first flare of certainty. She demanded to know what he was doing there. Steven didn't look embarrassed. He didn't apologize. He simply told her it was none of her business. In that moment, everything Alyssa had been trying not to see came into focus. She understood exactly what was happening. She pleaded with Katie to recognize the danger. But Katie, who had just met her biological father months earlier, couldn't process Alyssa's warnings. She believed Steven's calm explanations over Alyssa's fear. The manipulation had already begun. By November 2016, Alyssa had reached her breaking point. She filed for divorce. She gathered her 2 younger daughters and left the house, heartbroken, exhausted, and scared for what would happen next. As she drove away, she saw Steven standing in the doorway, unmoving, his expression unreadable. She didn't know it then, but that moment marked the beginning of a disaster none of them could stop. With Alyssa gone, Steven and Katie lived alone in the house. And without anyone there to draw boundaries or witness his behavior, Steven's fixation deepened. He bought tighter clothing. He grew out his hair. He trimmed his beard to look younger. The transformation wasn't subtle. It was intentional. He began introducing Katie to neighbors as his girlfriend. He told his younger daughters during weekend visits that Katie was special, someone they should respect. When one of them asked how she should address her older sister, Steven told her to call Katie stepmom. It was a moment that left Alyssa numb when she learned of it later. But nothing prepared her for the day she found her 11-year-old daughter's journal left open on the bed. Inside, written in a child's unguarded handwriting, were the lines that confirmed her worst fears. My dad calls her baby his baby. My dad says she's my stepmom. The journal also held drawings, childish, heartbreaking images of their father with horns, labeled the devil. Alyssa's chest tightened as she read. She had spent years warning others about Steven's behavior. She had tried to explain the danger he posed. But the system moved slowly, and without concrete evidence, no one intervened. Now she was holding the clearest evidence she had ever seen. She grabbed the phone and confronted Steven, shouting through tears, "You got her pregnant?" Steven didn't deny it. He didn't hesitate. He simply said, "I thought you knew. We're in love." The statement replayed in Alyssa's mind for weeks, not just for what it revealed, but for how easily he said it. Katie was 19 at the time. Steven was 42. He had been her father by blood long before she ever walked back into his life. But in his mind, none of that mattered. The reunion had warped into something he wanted protected at all costs. Alyssa called the police. She filed a report detailing everything she knew: the journal, the confession, the pregnancy. Detectives in Henrico County opened an investigation. But the law, limited by the fact that both Steven and Katie were adults, left little room for immediate action. Steven and Katie left Virginia soon after and moved to North Carolina, settling into a suburban home with Steven's mother. They lived openly there, presenting themselves as a married couple. They told neighbors they were expecting a baby. They set up a nursery. They acted as though the bond between them was normal, as though their relationship was not built on manipulation and 18 years of imbalance. What they couldn't run from forever was the truth catching up. By January 2018, Virginia authorities issued warrants for Steven and Katie's arrest on charges of incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Officers in North Carolina arrested the couple and extradited them to Virginia for booking. The world first learned their names through headlines that felt impossible. A father and daughter arrested as lovers, expecting a child together. Both Steven and Katie were released on bond with strict terms, no contact of any kind. Katie went back to New York to live with her adoptive parents, emotionally shattered, ashamed, and trying to piece together the reality she'd been pulled into without understanding its depth. Steven stayed in North Carolina, waiting for her to break. He believed she would. He believed she had to. He believed she was still his. But when she called him in early April to say she couldn't continue the relationship, something inside him fractured completely. And once it broke, the path toward the morning of April 12th became inevitable. In the weeks after her arrest, Katie tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy in the only place that had ever truly been her home. Returning to New York felt like stepping back into a world she had abandoned without understanding the consequences. Her adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco, welcomed her without hesitation, without judgment, without a single question she wasn't ready to answer. They focused only on protecting her. They had spent 18 years building a stable, loving foundation for their daughter, and now they had to find a way to help her understand that what happened in Virginia wasn't love. It was exploitation, manipulation, and a trauma she'd been pulled into without realizing its depth. Katie was quiet in those days. Friends noticed a change, but didn't press her. She had always been gentle, artistic, introspective, but now she seemed fragile in a way no one recognized. She slept often. She spoke in short sentences. The weight of the charges, the public exposure, and the humiliation of seeing her name in headlines cut into her deeply. Therapy became a refuge for her, a place where she began to separate her own identity from a narrative Steven had forced on her. It was a slow unraveling, painful but necessary. Steven, meanwhile, spiraled in the opposite direction. After the no-contact order was issued, he retreated into his mother's home in Cary, North Carolina, spending long stretches of time sitting in the dark, drinking, replaying old messages from Katie, and convincing himself he could still fix everything if she would just talk to him. The bond he believed they shared had been the center of his world. Without it, he was left with the same emptiness he had carried since his early adulthood, only now magnified, distorted, sharpened into something dangerous. Grace noticed a change in him almost immediately. She had seen his mood before, his sudden anger, his unpredictable shifts, but this was something different. He was hollow in a way she didn't know how to reach. She tried gently to talk to him, tried to remind him he had a child who needed him, tried to pull him back into routines that might tether him. But Steven was slipping into a psychological freefall, and every attempt she made only pushed him deeper into the quiet he used to mask what he was planning. The custody arrangement placed Bennett in Grace's care. Steven was allowed supervised involvement, but even that was fragile. He seemed lost, disconnected, emotionless. Grace didn't realize that he was already forming a plan, one shaped by heartbreak, delusion, and a belief that if he couldn't have a life he imagined with Katie, no one else deserved a future either. Everything escalated on April 11, 2018. Steven arrived at his mother's home late in the evening and asked to take Bennett for the night. He claimed he wanted to drive him to New York the next morning to bring the baby to Katie so they could work things out as a family. Grace hesitated. The custody court documents did not permit such a visit. The no-contact order between Steven and Katie made any travel to New York legally impossible. But Steven had always known how to apply pressure, how to speak with a tone that made mothers doubt themselves. Grace believed he wanted to fix things. She believed, or hoped, that Katie might have reached out. She believed that maybe, if Steven could at least see his son in a positive light, he might find enough peace to function again. So she let him take the baby. It was a decision she would carry for the rest of her life. Hours after Steven left with Bennett, the house felt wrong. Grace couldn't shake the unease. She called him repeatedly. No answer. She texted. Silence. She paced the living room, replaying the expression he had when he left, an emptiness she had tried to explain away. By midnight, that unease turned into fear. By dawn, it was dread. When her phone finally rang the next morning, she answered with shaking hands. Steven did not scream. He did not cry. He did not apologize. His voice was calm, as if he were giving simple instructions. Don't go to the house. I left the key under the mat. She asked about the baby, her voice cracking. The answer came with the same chilling steadiness. I killed him. She collapsed into the nearest chair, unable to breathe, unable to think. The world around her blurred, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether she was awake or trapped in a nightmare her mind had conjured. But Steven kept talking, explaining that he was already on his way to New York. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Grace understood, in the deepest part of her, that he was headed straight toward Katie. She dialed 911 as soon as the call ended. She told the dispatcher everything she knew. Her voice cracked as she explained that Steven was violating the no-contact order, that Katie was in New York, that the baby was alone in the house. Her sentences tumbled together, frantic and fragmented. The dispatcher tried to slow her down, tried to gather enough information to send units to the right locations. But time was already against them. By the time officers entered the house in Nightdale, Bennett was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to explain the baby's final moments. Only silence, a stroller in the corner, a carefully placed blanket, the unmistakable reality that the child never made it out of the house alive. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Steven was already nearing New York state lines. He had driven through the night in a rented minivan, fueled by obsession and the belief that the reunion he once had with Katie could somehow be reclaimed. He convinced himself that if he confronted her, if he forced a conversation she refused, he could bring her back into the world he had constructed around them. But Katie was no longer the girl who moved into his house in 2016. She was emerging from the delusion he had created. She was beginning to understand she was a victim. She was rebuilding her life with a family that had loved her from the beginning. She was reconnecting with who she had been before Steven's manipulation. And that reality, the loss of control, the loss of influence, the loss of power, was something Steven couldn't accept. On the morning of April 12th, Katie and her adoptive father, Tony Fusco, were driving along Route 55 and Route 7 in New Milford, Connecticut. They were on their way to visit Katie's grandmother, a routine trip they made often. The road was calm, framed by trees and early morning light. Neither of them knew Steven was behind them. Neither of them knew he had followed them for miles. Neither of them saw the moment he pulled up beside them at the red light. Witnesses would later say the sound didn't register as gunfire at first. It was too sudden, too loud, too close. One moment the intersection was quiet. The next, glass shattered across the road as bullets tore through the front seat of the Fusco's pickup truck. Cars slammed on brakes. People ducked. A New York firefighter driving behind them watched the entire scene unfold in seconds he couldn't later describe without his voice shaking. By the time emergency responders reached the scene, Katie and Tony were already gone. Steven sped away, heading north. Within 30 minutes, police found his van in Dover, New York, parked along a rural road near the area where Katie had grown up. Inside, they found Steven dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. 3 generations ended in one morning. A baby, a daughter, a father, and the man whose obsession destroyed them all. The investigation that followed confirmed what everyone already knew. Steven's final acts were not impulsive. They were deliberate. They were planned. And they were the violent culmination of a cycle that began long before Katie ever reached out on Facebook. But the story wasn't finished with the crime. In the days that followed, law enforcement, family members, and communities across 2 states tried to understand how something like this could unfold in plain sight, and how a reunion meant to heal an old wound became the first step toward an ending no one could stop. The intersection where Katie and her adoptive father were killed became still almost instantly. When the gunfire stopped, the world seemed trapped in the stunned silence left behind. Cars that had been moving moments earlier now sat frozen in place. Bystanders ducked behind open doors, unsure if more shots were coming. A New York firefighter, who happened to be directly behind the Fusco's vehicle, was the first to approach. He rushed forward, looked through fragmented glass, and saw what no first responder ever wants to see. Tony Fusco slumped behind the wheel. Katie sat beside him, her head resting against a shattered window. There was no movement from either of them. Their lives had ended before the light had a chance to change. The firefighter dialed 911 with urgency layered beneath his voice. He described the scene, the blue minivan speeding away, the bodies in the truck. He tried to shield the sight from passing cars, parking his own vehicle at an angle so children or other motorists wouldn't have to glimpse what he had just witnessed. He knew it was too late to save them. His words reflected that grim clarity. "Brains are on the road," he told the dispatcher. "They're both deceased." Within minutes, Connecticut State Police arrived. The intersection was cordoned off. Traffic was rerouted. Officers began marking shell casings, photographing the bullet trajectories, and securing witness statements. Workers at nearby shops stepped outside, staring at the scene with disbelief. This was a quiet town, a place where the worst disruptions were usually minor collisions or traffic backups on holiday weekends. The violence of this act didn't match the setting. It seemed torn from a reality that belonged elsewhere. News of the shooting traveled quickly. The first officers on scene relayed the vehicle description, a blue minivan with a North Carolina license plate, across multiple jurisdictions. State police in New York were alerted. Patrol cars along nearby highways were notified. Helicopters scanned the area. But Steven didn't run far. He didn't even attempt to hide. Just half an hour after the shooting, a trooper in Dover, New York, spotted the minivan parked on the shoulder of a rural road bordered by thick woods. It was near the area where the Fuscos lived, close to the quiet streets Katie had walked as a child, close to the home where she had grown up believing she was safe. The trooper approached the vehicle cautiously. The windows were fogged from the inside. When he opened the door, he found Steven slumped in the front seat, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was the final act of a chain of violence that had begun long before dawn, long before the first phone call, long before the morning drive that ended on Route 7. Steven had carried his plan through to completion. The baby was gone. Katie was gone. Tony was gone. And now he was gone too. As word spread across agencies, phones rang in rapid succession. Officers in North Carolina were informed that the suspected killer they were searching for was dead in New York. Officials in Connecticut were notified that the shooting suspect had been located deceased. The information moved quickly, but not fast enough to soften the devastation waiting for the families involved. Back in Dover, Kelly Fusco had spent the morning preparing for what she believed would be an ordinary day. Tony and Katie had left the house not long before, heading out to visit Katie's grandmother. They made that trip twice a week. Kelly expected them home by afternoon. She had no reason to worry. There were no signs of danger. The morning had seemed mundane. When officers knocked on her door, she assumed they were there for something unrelated, perhaps a neighborhood matter or a request for information about an incident down the street. She had no reason to brace for the words that followed. 2 lives, her daughter, her husband, both gone. For a moment she couldn't speak. The world around her dimmed at the edges. There is no instruction manual for how to absorb grief of that magnitude. The officers tried to proceed with sensitivity, but the brutality of the truth they needed to deliver left no space for gentleness. Kelly collapsed into a chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably. A sound escaped her that didn't resemble a voice at all. Something primal. Something that came from the deepest part of a person breaking. News traveled next to Katie's grandmother. The phone call shattered her. Tony had been her son. Katie had been her granddaughter. Losing them together in a single violent act felt impossible to grasp. They were family members she had seen only hours earlier. Now, they were names spoken in past tense. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, officers had located the small Nightdale home where Steven had left Bennett. They found the baby positioned carefully, wrapped in a blanket. There were no bruises, no visible injuries, nothing to suggest struggle. What they did find was enough evidence to confirm that the child had been deliberately suffocated. Investigators searched the house room by room, hoping for any sign of a note or explanation, but there was nothing. Steven had taken the truth of those final minutes with him. Grace, who had placed her grandson into her son's arms the night before believing she was making a reasonable decision, received the news from police. Her reaction was devastation, layered with disbelief. She had tried to help Steven through years of unpredictable moods, tried to intervene when he spiraled, tried to be a buffer between him and the world he never seemed equipped to navigate. But nothing in her long effort could prepare her for the reality that he had taken the life of her grandson, and nothing could prepare her for the knowledge that he had then driven across state lines to kill 2 more people. When she learned that Steven had killed himself, her grief shifted again. She had lost her son. She had lost her grandson. She had lost whatever fragile hope she once held that Steven could be guided back toward stability. The guilt consumed her. The what-ifs, the decisions she replayed over and over, the moment she let him take benefit of the night, the moment she didn't demand he stay, the moment she believed his lies. Investigators in 3 states worked rapidly to piece together the sequence of events. They coordinated timelines, reviewed surveillance footage, analyzed phone records, and interviewed witnesses. Each agency confirmed its part of the tragedy. The infant's death in North Carolina, the double homicide in Connecticut, the suicide in New York. It was a multi-state chain of violence, all carried out within hours. Media outlets began reporting the story as details became public. Headlines described the case with phrases that seemed impossible to comprehend. A father in an incestuous relationship with his biological daughter, a baby born of that relationship, a custody dispute, an arrest for incest, a no-contact order, and then the murders. Comment sections flooded with shock and horror. Reporters repeated statements from police press conferences. The story spread far beyond the borders of the 3 states involved. But beneath the media coverage, the heart of the tragedy lay in a family that had been torn apart without warning. Friends of the Fuscos described Tony as a quiet, devoted father, a man who worked hard, rarely raised his voice, and loved his children deeply. They described Katie as compassionate, artistic, and full of potential. They couldn't fathom how a young woman who once filled sketchbooks with bright drawings ended up caught in such darkness. They couldn't understand how a reunion meant to bring clarity to her life had instead destroyed it. In New York, the Fusco home filled with relatives, friends, and neighbors who came with food, condolences, and silent embraces. No one had the right words. There were no right words. Everything felt inadequate in the face of such loss. In North Carolina, Grace remained in her home, blinds drawn, overwhelmed by grief. She rarely spoke to reporters. She rarely spoke to anyone. Her son had committed acts she could not reconcile. Her grandson was gone. Her world had collapsed in one morning. And in Virginia, Alyssa faced a unique, devastating grief of her own, grieving a daughter she'd given up to protect, only for her to be taken anyway. She told reporters in a trembling voice, "I lost my daughter 3 times. At birth, to him, and forever. 3 families, 3 states, 3 lives gone. Yet the full reckoning of what happened still wasn't finished." In the days that followed, investigators uncovered more details, documents, online exchanges, evidence of manipulation and coercion that painted a clearer picture of how the reunion transformed into obsession. The truth was simple and brutal. What began as a search for identity became the catalyst for a tragedy no one could stop. And as investigators prepared their final reports, one question remained: how did so many warning signs pass unnoticed? In the days after the murders, as detectives, reporters, and grieving families tried to make sense of what had happened, a painful question began to circulate across 3 states. How does a tragedy like this move through the world unnoticed until the final moment? The answer was not simple. It stretched back decades through missed warning signs, legal limitations, and the quiet power of manipulation. For investigators, the first step was reconstructing the full trajectory of the case. From the moment Alyssa gave up her infant daughter to protect her, to the moment Steven ended the lives of 3 people before turning the gun on himself. Every timeline they built circled the same truth. The violence did not start on April 12th. It was a result of years of unchecked patterns. Records from New York and Virginia showed that Steven had struggled with anger and control long before Katie ever reached out on Facebook. His relationship with Alyssa, when she was still a teenager, had been defined by volatility. She had documented instances of intimidation, emotional abuse, and threats during their time together. And yet, most of those incidents occurred in the early 2000s, before domestic violence protections and online monitoring had tightened. They were shadows in the background of an old relationship, not actionable data. When Alyssa surrendered baby Denise, later renamed Katie, the agency notes reflected only what she could safely disclose at the time: instability in the home, an unsafe environment, and the belief that keeping the baby would expose her to harm. Those notes protected the infant. They did not protect the teenager she would later become. No one involved in the adoption process could have predicted what would unfold 18 years later. The next stage of the timeline revealed something even more difficult for investigators to process: the 2016 reunion, the emotional vulnerability of an 18-year-old searching for identity, and the manipulative ease with which Steven stepped into a role he had no right to hold. In therapy sessions after her arrest, Katie had begun to articulate the truth she had been unable to see while living with him. She spoke about the confusion of meeting a parent she had never known, the desire to connect, and the pressure she felt to please him. She described the need for belonging that Steven exploited. When investigators reviewed the psychological framework behind genetic sexual attraction, they saw patterns that mirrored what happened in this case: rapid bonding, blurred boundaries, and the dangerous illusion of intimacy created by biological familiarity. But GSA is not a diagnosis or a defense. It is a phenomenon understood only as a risk factor, one that becomes catastrophic when combined with controlling personality and an absence of safeguards. What happened between Steven and Katie was not love. It was grooming shaped by biology, isolation, and Steven's manipulative tendencies. Investigators documented that clearly in their final reports. The next stage in the chain, the pregnancy, was the turning point that should have triggered intervention. When Alyssa discovered the truth through her daughter's journal, she took the appropriate steps. She filed a report. She gave evidence. She pleaded for immediate action. Yet investigators in Virginia face an obstacle that is difficult for public to understand. Both Steven and Katie were adults, and the law at the time did not classify their relationship as coercive without testimony or evidence directly proving force or exploitation. They were wrongfully labeled as two consenting adults, despite the power imbalance being clear to anyone with a psychological lens. Authorities reopened a case in late 2017, but by then Steven and Katie had moved across state lines, and the gap between reporting and gathering enough evidence to file charges became the window through which Steven created an entirely new life in North Carolina. This is where investigators identified the most painful bureaucratic failure. Had the charges come sooner, had coordination between states moved faster, had laws recognized the complexity of incest involving newly reconnected biological families, intervention might have been possible before Katie became pregnant, before she moved states, before she married him under false pretenses, before the illusion of a family hardened into something Steven believed was his right to protect at any cost. Even after the arrest in January 2018, the system's limitations became brutally clear. The no-contact order placed strict boundaries on Steven, but enforcing such orders across states is notoriously difficult. Monitoring violations often relies on self-reporting or incidental detection. Katie followed the order. Steven did not. And the very nature of the order, intended to protect her, became the trigger for his final collapse. Investigators reconstructed Steven's movements in the days leading up to the murders. He stopped showing up for work. He barely spoke to anyone. His online search history reflected a rapid descent into fixation. He searched for updates on Katie. He looked at old photographs. He checked court documents repeatedly. He purchased a rental minivan on April 11th, and he told no one the truth about what he planned to do next. Grace was the last person he spoke to. She believed he only wanted to deliver the baby to Katie, despite the no-contact order. It was a belief rooted in hope, not reality. She had spent years trying to hold onto whatever good parts of her son she could find. She could not have imagined that he had already killed the child she handed him the night before. When investigators examined Steven's final hours, They found a man who had already accepted the outcome. He had brought the gun with him. He had chosen a route that followed Katie's routine. He had tracked her movements. None of it was spontaneous. It was planned violence shaped by obsession, rejection, and a distorted belief that if he couldn't have his family, no one else should. The intersection where Tony and Katie were killed became more than a crime scene. It became another point on a map that investigators used to illustrate the consequences of a series of missed opportunities. Some caused by legal limitations, some by timing, some by systemic gaps that no one recognized until it was too late. The funerals took place days later. Katie was buried beside the man who had raised her, a father who never failed her, a father who tried to protect her until the very end. Tony's casket was lowered into ground first. Katie's followed. The image of two coffins side by side cut through a community that had always known the Fuscos as kind, private, and family-oriented. Their deaths left a ripple that touched neighbors, teachers, co-workers, and friends who still speak of them with reverence. At Bennett's small service in North Carolina, only a handful of relatives attended. Grace stood quietly near the front, holding on to a program she couldn't bring herself to look at. The loss of her grandson was compounded by the loss of her son, and by the knowledge that both deaths were tied to decisions she had made while trying to help. In the weeks that followed, lawmakers, advocates, and psychologists used the case to highlight the complexities surrounding reunions between adoptees and biological parents. Experts emphasize that emotional vulnerability, unresolved trauma, and power imbalances can create dangerous dynamics if not monitored. Conversations emerge around the country about instituting guidance for reunification counseling, something that might have made a difference for Katie. But the most powerful reflection came from Alyssa herself. Speaking to reporters, she described her grief plainly. "I lost my daughter 3 times," she said. "At birth, to him, and forever." Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. She wanted people to understand what had truly happened. Not as a sensational story, but as a failure of protection, a failure of boundaries, and a failure to see the danger that had been present for years. As the investigation concluded, detectives from all 3 states agreed on the final narrative. This was a tragedy rooted not in sudden violence, but in long-term manipulation, emotional vulnerability, and a collapse of safeguards that should have protected everyone involved. The final case files closed with more questions than answers. Could the adoption agency have predicted this? Could Virginia authorities have acted sooner? Could the no-contact order have been enforced differently? Could Steven's mother have recognized the signs? Could Katie have been pulled out sooner? Could anyone have changed what happened on April 12th? There is no single answer. What remains is the story of a young woman who wanted to understand her origins, a father who weaponized her vulnerability, a family that loved her deeply, and a tragedy that spread across 3 states in a matter of hours. And as Criminal Mind Tales often asks in closing, not because the story needs resolution, but because reflection is the only thing left. What warning signs do you believe were missed? And how do we prevent another family from facing a loss like this? Thank you for watching, for listening, and for honoring the victims by remembering their names and their stories.